Hello, welcome to the video. Thanks for coming back. It's been a little while since I did my last video, which was on the best of progressive rock. But I finally got around to doing this video today, and today I'm going to talk about punk rock. And you might think, hang on a second, how can somebody who likes progressive rock be into punk rock as well? Well, I was around at the time, in 76, 77, 78, and I remember the day I bought Nevermind the Bollocks by the Sex Pistols, that in my bag at the same time was Hotel California by the Eagles and Gone to Earth by Bartley James Harvest, which is about as far as you can get away from punk within the rock genre. What did I like about punk rock? Well, it was really exciting at the time, but it was like aggressive, it was confrontational. The persona of the bands were often very menacing, and it was a real departure from the prog rock years. I mean, sitting at a prog rock concert, often you'd be sitting there with your arms folded, kind of impress me, just enjoying, wallowing, in fact, in the highs and the lows and the fast and the slow and so on and so forth. And then you went to a punk gig and it was just like this oral onslaught, just this noise coming from the stage that you just could not ignore. There's no standing around with your arms folded at a punk gig. You really were right involved. And some of the most exciting gigs I ever saw were punk bands during that particular period. Now I'm going to kind of focus on this period, mainly in the UK, obviously, from 77 through to around 1980, which is where I think the punk bands really made the difference. But firstly, before I go, I'm going to talk about my top 10. So before I go into the detail of each of the individual albums, I think there's one thing I want to say about the myth that prog rock was some sort of a rail against progressive rock or hard rock in general, that it was this idea that prog rock needed to be swept away and punk was the movement that was going to do it. Well, I've never subscribed to that view. I mean, I was around at the time. I can tell you it was not the thing. Prog rock was an album genre. So you'd buy these albums, you'd sit there, you'd listen from front to back. You'd listen to the album a dozen times before you really got into it and so on and so forth. And punk came along, not against prog rock. It came along against the charts at the time. So I've just printed off the top 100 UK singles in 1976, and I think there's a clue here of why punk needed to come along. The number one single of the year was Save Your Kisses for Me by Brotherhood of Man. You had in the top 10 Shawaddy Waddy, who had been putting out single after single, some sort of a rock and roll pastiche, like a comedy act really. Then you had Demis Roussos, Leo Sayer, whose first album was really good but became really bland later on. You've got Glass of Champagne by Sailor, Jeans On by David Dundas. For goodness sake, I mean, Manuel and the Music of the Mountains, number 37th biggest selling single of the year. And you had the Wurzels, the Bellamy Brothers and others. And it was just the singles. I mean, when you think about the early 70s, there was glam rock, you had bands like Mott the Hoople, you had David Bowie, you had Sparks, you had T-Rex, you had Wizard, you had Status Quo, if you like, from the more hard rock end of the spectrum. But the singles charts were really interesting, but by the time you got to 75 and 76, it was all Brotherhood of Man or the Electric Light Orchestra, and it was just dull. And something needed to come along to shake the whole thing up, and punk came along. And I think one of the reasons why the movement caught on is that the journalists really loved the hedonistic lifestyle. So they liked the booze and the drugs and the partying and so on and so forth, which I think, as I've said in a previous video, that they found progressive rock musicians too obsessive and too boring, too uninteresting for them. They wanted to party and get access to cheap booze and so on. So anyway, so I think punk came along because it needed to come along, and I don't think it was some sort of a rail against prog. It was a rail against the singles charts that had become really boring. So my top 10 prog albums. So number 10, this one, Crossing the Red Sea with TheAdvert. This is a good album. It's of its time. It still sounds kind of high energy, which is kind of defines the genre, but it was it's not as interesting as I thought it was going to be when I listened to it again quite recently, and it's docked 1 star because it doesn't include the fantastic single Gary Gilmore's Eyes. I think this was the first pressing. It's on red vinyl, and it's I think later on they started adding Gary Gilmore's Eyes to it, but it's still good. One Chord Wonders, Bored Teenagers is really good. New Church is good. These were all kind of real single type tracks. You've got The Great British Mistake, close of the album, is really good as well. No Time to Be 21. But anyway, so that's number 10. I like it. It's still good. It kind of is it's a peek into the era. Kind of not the best album, but it's up there. It's up there. Number 9, Public Image. When John Lydon ended the Sex Pistols, and they all split, we're all wondering what he was going to do because he was the icon of the punk movement at the time. I mean, there are better bands around, but he was the guy, and we were wondering what he was going to do. And they released the single Public Image. And it came in newspaper, wrapped in a newspaper thing, and it was just a brilliant single. Quite different in sound from the Sex Pistols. Very much a bass-dominated sound. The vocals were a little bit receding in the mix, so he wasn't really front and center like he was with the Sex Pistols. But this album is kind of a bit of a hard listen. It's really dissonant, but it's varied, and it's as long as you like that bass and those chiming, echoey guitars, it still remains very, very interesting. It's kind of almost like kind of new wave, as we all know, punk morphed into new wave. So a lot of bands you might expect me to talk about here became much more famous a little bit later on. But only Public Image, great album. Metal Box was the album to get, is the one I think that has stood the test of time, but this is still a great album, great debut. Number 8 is Damned. The Damned, the first album. This is a great album. Again, like I've already said with TheAdvert, it's a window onto this period. What was interesting about The Damned, 2 things really. One, they did it with a smile on their face. I mean, they kind of knew how to have fun. They had Captain Sensible on bass guitar, David Vanian vocals, Rat Scabies on the drums. They were kind of a fun band, and they had 2 of the best singles in punk, New Rose and Neat. Absolutely tremendous. Really, really great album. Much more sophisticated than you initially think. It still stands up to date. It's a really, really good album. So that's number 8. Number 7, we might describe them as punk imposters, but they certainly had all the energy, and they had the aggressive frontman that was kind of almost defines the genre as well. And that was the first album by the Boomtown Rats. Geldof, he's a hard to love character. Last time I saw him, he was in a suit with a colleague on an aeroplane, sitting in business class on his way to Switzerland, off to see the bank, presumably. The previous time I'd seen him in person, he was fronting the Boomtown Rats, and I saw them several times, and he was really charismatic. There's no doubt about it. He was a really great frontman. This has got some fantastic singles on it that, right in to the, almost define the genre as well. You're Looking After number 1 is great. Mary of the Fourth Form, which is going to do you in. Never Bite the Hands That Feeds. Did betray a love of Springsteen on Joy's on the Street Again. Look, it sounds like it could be an outtake, a speeded up one from one of the early Springsteen albums. Full of energy, really, really good album. Good band, really good band live as well. Whatever happened to Bob Geldof, eh? So that was 10, 9, 8, 7, number 6. Radis Norvegicus by the Stranglers. My first exposure to punk rock. I was on a holiday camp, 16 years old, I think, with a handful of friends. Pontins it was, and in Morecambe. And punk had just come along, the Stranglers had come along, and we were pogoing in the disco to the tracks, the singles that were released here. So, you know, it was Grip, Hanging Around, Peaches is amazing. And one thing to say, they were really aggressive and really menacing, but they're also the most sexist band you'd ever come across. I mean, they talk here about where is it? Get a Grip on Yourself. Of Peaches. But there's a track on the second album. The name has just slipped my mind, but it's really, really dodgy. But yeah, they were a great live band. I didn't see them in the heyday. I saw them a few years ago. Obviously, Hugh Cornwell, the singer, who was great, great frontman as well. He wasn't with them, but they were still a good show, still a good live band. So they still were very a lot more sophisticated. And of course, after the Black and White album, which came out, I think it was the third album, which was really aggressive as well. Nice and Sleazy is a great single off that. They became much more varied in their musical style and produced a whole series of albums that are well worth listening to. But this is kind of the punk album. This and maybe the second album, No More Heroes, which is not as good as the first one. Number 5. Right, number 5. All Mod Cons, The Jam. Now, Paul Weller, he was great in The Jam. In the early years, he really was an angry young man. I mean, he sounded the real deal. 3 guys, guitar, bass and drums, and they made a hell of a racket. They played fast. The first 2 albums are really full of fast songs. This was a little bit more rounded off. This is A-Bomb on Water Street is great. And of course, the big single here is Down in the Tube Station at Midnight. But you got To Be Someone. They did a version of the King's David Watts. Billy Hunt. It is a really, really good album. Now, Weller, as I say, he's not exactly my cup of tea. The Angry Young Man sounded right, but later on, and I think in his solo stuff, his voice has never really sounded authentic as it did back in the day. So he's produced some good albums and he's a good songwriter. There's no doubt about it. But his voice is he's hard to love really. But anyway, this was a great, great album. All Mod Cons. This mod father persona he has is kind of become embarrassing, I think. Never really liked that whole thing. Punk imposter? Maybe. Tell you who were punk imposters. Number 4. The Police. Outlanders D'Amour. Staying out of background in a local band, Last Exit, in Newcastle, my hometown. I think I saw them one time on a Sunday afternoon at a place just outside the university. I've forgotten the name of it now. Used to put bands on Sunday afternoon. He played bass guitar and sing, and you got Stuart Copeland, who was with Curved Air, kind of a proggy band as well, and Andy Summers, not too dissimilar background as well. But they all dyed their hair blonde and really went for it. So they played fast. They were also aggressive. I mean, Sting seemed to be a bit of a hard nut. And there's one experience where I saw them on the Zenyatta Mondata tour, which is the 3rd album. We were on holiday, me and a few pals, in the south of France. Camping holiday, cheap as it comes. And we managed to get tickets to see the Police play at an amphitheatre in Fréjus, or Fréjus, I'm not sure how you pronounce it. But on the bill, you had UB40 and XTC before they stopped touring. So it was a great night out. And I remember there must have been some French guy up the front who was spitting at Sting. And Sting was getting a bit agitated, and he told this guy if he didn't stop, he was going to deal with him. Anyway, this guy continued spitting. And Sting put his bass guitar down, jumped off the stage and started beating this guy up, presumably with the help of a roadie or some sort of a security guy as well. Anyway, a minute later, Sting was back on stage and the gig continued. But punks when they wanted to be, but didn't like all the hassle that came with it, because I mean the spitting back in those days was bloody awful. If you were down the front, it was horrible. But yeah, great album. I think it's authentic as a punk album. I mean, Next to You is great. Obviously the hits, So Lonely, Roxanne, and Constant Losing You. Truth Hits Everybody. Yeah, Peanuts, Whole of My Life. Yeah, full of great tracks. This is an album you can definitely listen to from beginning to end. So great album, definitely worthy of number 4 in my top 10 of so-called punk albums. Number 3 is the iconic, never mind the you know what's, by the Pistols. This is 30th anniversary edition. I don't know what happened to my original copy of this. Maybe I sold it. Maybe when CDs came along, I did sell a few albums and I was off it for a while, but this is undeniably a great album and it's full of absolute punk classics. So Pretty Vacant, God Save the Queen, Anarchy in the UK, EMI, Holidays in the Sun, the anti-abortion song Bodies, which is just truly shocking, or it was truly shocking at the time. And you used to play it and just pray that your mother didn't walk into your bedroom while it was playing, because it was just really kind of not the sort of thing you want your mother to hear. But yeah, No Feelings, Liar, it's great. This is full of fantastic songs. Great band. Never saw them live, but really good. And it's kind of, just to link back to prog for a second, it's said John Lydon, Johnny Rotten, said one of his greatest influences was an album by a guy called Peter Hamill, which is this one, called Nadea's Big Chance. And there's the title track, which is really very punky. And there's another one in particular, which is the same. Where is it? Birthday Special. Both of them sound, particularly the title track, sounds like it could be a Sex Pistols track. And now, if you know anything about Peter Hamill, that is just so bizarre to think about it that way. But he uses the term punk in the lyrics. But literally, you can listen to that and just think, my God, if this was the Pistols playing and John Lydon out in front, Johnny Rotten out in front, this would easily fit on Never Mind the Bollocks, that track. So that's Peter Hamill. I'll talk about Peter Hamill in another video and his band Van der Graaf Generator. But yeah, bizarrely an influence on the Pistols. My favourite band in the punk genre, however, come at number 2. And I saw this band several times. They are the Ruts. This is a fantastic album. You really can listen to this from beginning to end. They had the best frontman in punk. I mean, even though John Lydon's the guy and he's the icon, Malcolm Owen was the real deal. Malcolm Owen could not only come across as some sort of an aggressive skinhead type, looked hard as nails, but he could really sing. He could shout and sing, but he had a really deep voice, and he looked really, really menacing. And he was menacing on stage. These guys played fast, but they could also play skillfully. Babylon's Burning is the most famous track, but Dope for Guns is fantastic with the rhythm section in particular. Sus, Something That I Said, You're Just was a really fast punk one. Savage Circle, very similar. Then Jah War, the greatest reggae influenced track in punk, bar none. About 7 minutes, absolutely fantastic. Great singing, great rhythm section, really excellent. Criminal Mind, Backbiter, Human Punk. Oh, what a fantastic album. That is almost made my number 1, but definitely my favourite band. They're still touring today. I saw them a couple of years ago. Obviously, Malcolm took a drug overdose and died very, very young. But they've toured without him. They've continued to make albums from time to time. And they're still a good night out. They're still worth saying. But they've never been able to replace Malcolm Owen because he was the real deal. Right, number one, the greatest punk album, bar none, despite the Ruts album, The Crack, being number two. And it's this one, London Calling. Now, this is a bit of a stretch because the first Clash album is very punky indeed. But I find it hard to listen to these days because everything is kind of, it's apart from Police and Thieves, it's a bit of one paced. It's very, very fast. It sounds really tinny, very high end. There's no bass on it really, maybe because Paul Simonon couldn't play bass very well at the beginning. But it's good, but this is a great album. Now, this is kind of genre busting because this is not only one of the best punk albums of all time and my favourite punk album of all time, it's also one of the greatest rock albums of all time. This stands up against anything that's out there. London Calling, amazing, Brand New Cadillac, Hateful, Jimmy Jazz, Lost in the Supermarket, The Guns of Brixton. There's just so many great tracks. Train in Vain closes the album. It's not listed on this first edition, but brilliant album and a brilliant live band. And when you saw the Clash live, it was just like this great big rush from the stage of this noise, these chiming guitars that they had, and it was really exciting. They were never ever boring. The last time I saw them, bizarrely, was on their busking tour. I used to hang out in this record shop in my hometown in Newcastle on a Saturday afternoon with a pal. And there was a whisper from the other side of the counter saying, we think the Clash might be playing this small club, I think it was called The Station or something, in Gateshead across the River Tyne. So me and my mate went across and we walked into this place. There was no tickets, anything. We just walked in. And there was about 30 of us in this hall. It was really quite small. Just chatting, standing around thinking, is this for real? Is it really going to happen? And after about half an hour or so, maybe it was an hour, I don't know, I can't remember, the Clash walked in, walked up onto the stage with acoustic guitars, and they had a drummer who was using a cardboard box and a chair, presumably from the hall itself. And they proceeded to play for, I don't know, 45 minutes or an hour, played kind of all the hits, but acoustic style. And it was really great. And I remember walking out, we got chatting to Paul and Joe, and I just learned to drive, and I had my first car, which was a beat up old Mini. And they were going off to Sunderland, which is about 10-12 miles away, to do another kind of freebie gig. And I said to Joe, I said, do you guys want to lift? Because, you know, it'd be fantastic to have the two members of the Clash in the back of the car down to Sunderland. But I don't know whether it was because they looked at my car and thought, no way am I getting in that. Or maybe the real thing is what they did tell me, in that they were using public transport to get around the country. So they had to go on the train or the bus to get there. But they were absolutely amazing band, absolutely fantastic. So that, I think, is my favourite punk album. That's my top 10. But I should mention a few others and maybe explain why one or two famous bands aren't included. So, for example, I've kind of focused on the aggression and the energy and less on the pop sensibility that is present in a lot of these punk bands, particularly the ones that bridge the divide between punk and new wave. So I've not included the Undertones, great band. I've not included the Buzzcocks, they're a bit too poppy for me. The punk ethos was there on the B-52s and early XTC, but I've not included them either. And of course, Blondie were in there. Bands that I could have mentioned but didn't: Sham 69, Stiff Little Fingers, X-Ray Specs, all good. Don't think the albums are as good as the others that I've mentioned. And then you've got the more art rocky style of punk. And I've brought a couple of albums here. There you got Buzzcocks, of course, and the Undertones. But New York Dolls, which was the glam influence, I think 73, I think that was. I remember a friend lent it to me at the same time, or around the same time he lent me Selling England by the Pound by Genesis. This didn't make any sense to me whatsoever, but that is a really good album and worth getting. And of course the amazing Patti Smith. poetry set to music rather than punk, I think. Just because they did a punky version of Gloria doesn't qualify it to be one of the best punk albums, but certainly one of the great rock albums of all time. Didn't include Elvis Costello. Elvis Costello's second album is very punk orientated. And then two bands I've not mentioned because they just passed me by. Iggy and the Stooges. I mean, I've got the early albums, but they've never really, they weren't around at the time as far as I was concerned. They didn't get on my radar. And I didn't really get into Iggy Pop until he did the American Caesar album many, many years later, which I think is a great album. And you've also got the Ramones, which seem a bit too cartoonish to me. And that's undoubtedly doing them a disservice. But they again passed me by, and I listened to a few singles over the years, and I find them in punk compilations from time to time, and they were good, but they weren't in my punk world at the time. So yeah, that's my top 10 punk albums, plus a few others, a few honourable mentions, and that's I guess that's it. So I hope you enjoyed the video. I'm glad you agree with me on the top 10. And I'll see you next time. Thanks a lot.